sum myself up in one phrase.
Yes. Who is Tom Verner?
Sweet Jesus, how do I do that? So my name is Tom Verner, and I'm a magician and a psychologist and a college professor. And with Magicians Without Borders, all three of those have come together in my life. Right? So I was working in a drug and alcohol hospital for people with drug and alcohol problems. And one weekend a month I had to spend at a residential treatment center for people recovering from drug addiction. And there was a man there by the name of Milton, and he was a heroin addict, but he had been a professional magician. But his whole magic career had gone down because of drugs. And I begged him to teach me only one trick. Just, Milton, teach me one trick. No. So about 2 months later, he was assigned to me as my patient. So I had to see him for 1 hour a week. And he came into the first counseling session and he said, okay, 50 minutes is mine and 10 minutes is yours. So for 2 years, 10 minutes a week, I had a magic lesson. And he said to me, if you practice what I teach you, like he might teach me the French drop, he said, practice it all week, show it to me next week. If you've mastered it, I'll teach you something else. And that went on for 2 years. And then 3 or 4 years later, I was writing my PhD dissertation in psychology, and his name was Milton. He and I opened a magic shop together, and his life was doing very well. He was a professional magician again, and I was writing and 3 days a week working in a magic shop. So that's how I became a magician. Yeah, when I finished and got my PhD in psychology, I sold my half of the magic shop to Milton, and he kept it going for a number of years. And I went on for the next, say, 10 years, just doing a little bit of magic, but mainly concentrated on psychology, practicing and teaching. But I've always done psychology, teaching, and magic. But sometimes more magic, sometimes less magic. But then 20 years ago, I started Magicians Without Borders, and I can tell you a little bit about how that got started. Okay, I was going to a meeting in Poland, a conference in Poland, and on my way, through interesting magical kind of circumstances, I ended up in Kosovo during the Balkan War, and someone took me to a refugee camp. It was in Kosovo, on the Macedonia-Kosovo border. And on the way to the camp, this man said, I'm going to introduce you to someone who will be your guide in the camp today. Her name is Fatima. She knows everybody in the camp. It was a small camp, about 2,000 people. And he said, Fatima knows everybody. And she's only 6 years old. So we went into the camp, went over to a little kind of house made from the stuff from the garbage dump. And we rattled on this piece of metal, and there was this beautiful, big, brown-eyed Roma. She was what some people call gypsies. She was a gypsy girl, but they don't like gypsy. They like Roma. And all day I was with Fatima. And she was just a very, very bright, intelligent young girl. She didn't speak English. I didn't speak Roma. But somehow we understood each other. If I needed a glass of water, or if I needed a table, or if I needed a volunteer, Fatima would get it for me. So we did 3 or 4 shows in the refugee camp. It was time to leave. Fatima was standing beside me. I was talking to some Roma women, and I said goodbye, and I turned, and Fatima was gone. And I said to the Roman women, I said, do you know where Fatima is? And they said, we thought she was with you. I said, she was all day, but now she's gone. And I said, would you please say goodbye to her for me? And I felt badly I wasn't going to get to say goodbye. So I took my magic bag, I walked over to the car, I looked in the car, and there's Fatima hiding on the floor in the back seat of the car, wanting to run away with the magician from the refugee camp. So the Roma women came over and they spoke to her. She was a good Roma girl. She took her best shot. It didn't work. She waved us down the road, goodbye. And we drove about 20 minutes. And the man from the United Nations who was driving me around, we came to a town called Shutka. And he said, Shutka's not really a refugee camp, but it's swollen with refugees. And it's very sad in Shutka. They could use some magic. So we go into the refugee camp, or into Shutka, and we set up a table, and I put my magic props on the table, and about 350 people come within 10 minutes. So I do the show, and the show goes over pretty well. Everybody leaves except about 3 or 4 Roma men. And this Roma woman, she comes up to me, and she has a small little coin, much smaller than this. And she put it in my hand. And she had seen me multiply sponge balls and flowers, but she put a 5 Macedonian coin in my hand, and she pointed to it. She said, make more money. She wanted to see if my magic had any market value. So I squeezed the coin, and there was a piece of gold, fake gold, what we call fool's gold. And I went to drop it in her hand. She said, no, 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 more money. So I put the gold back in my hand. I reached into my pocket, got some magic dust, squeezed it, and there was 10 times, not 5, but 50 dinars. And I dropped it in her hand, and she walked away with a big smile on her face. Instantly, 2 of these Roma men said to me, make us visas to America. And I laughed like you, and they were not laughing. They were completely serious. They had just seen money multiply tenfold. Certainly I could pull a visa out of the air. So that night I went back to Skopje in Macedonia, where I was staying, and I was thinking about what had happened. I've been in hundreds of refugee camps over almost 20 years now, but this was the very, very first time I had ever been in a refugee camp. And I'm writing in my journal, and I learned 2 very important things that are at the center, at the heart of Magicians Without Borders. I realized none of the people I performed for knew English. I didn't speak their language, they didn't speak my language, but they all spoke magic. They all understood magic, something appearing, something disappearing, something changing. So that was the first thing. Magic is a universal language. China, India, the Middle East, South America, North Europe, everywhere. The other thing was, I thought of something Harry Houdini said once. He said, sometimes when I perform magic, especially for people in difficult situations, it not only amazes and amuses, but sometimes it awakens hope that the impossible is possible. And I said, that's what I saw. With Fatima, she saw magic. She thought, maybe I can escape from Moment Potok refugee camp. Those men in Shutka, they saw magic. They thought, maybe we can go to America and realize our hopes and dreams. So the two things about Magicians Without Borders was born that day: a universal language of magic, and the impossible is possible, and hope. So that's the beginnings and the heart of Magicians Without Borders. Well, there was a young man in New York, a magician named Michael Muldoon, and he has a funny hand. He has a little finger coming out of here. He has six fingers, and his name is Six. And he says he does magic with an extra touch. And so Six said to me, because we had started teaching magic, and he saw how it was making these children change and grow, and we were using magic to entertain. And he said to me one day, he said, you know, the mission of Magicians Without Borders is to entertain, to use the art of magic to entertain, educate, and empower sometimes forgotten people, especially children. So that was part of the evolution. The first 7 years or so, we only did entertainment. We traveled to almost 38 countries and performed mainly in refugee camps and orphanages. And by UN estimates, we've now performed for over 1 million refugee and orphan children. But then, after about 7 years, we were in El Salvador, and we were working with an NGO who we went around to different places, and they had an after-school program. And the head of the NGO said, we have a couple of children who have been doing very, very well in school. Would you teach them some magic as a reward for doing well in school? And I said, fine, we'll do it. So we spent the day together with about 10 wonderful children: Jaime, Peter, Maricela, Wendy, and they learned about 5 or 6 tricks, and they just seemed to love it. And at the end of the day, I was leaving, and Jaime said to me, when are you coming back to teach us more magic? I hadn't even planned to come back to El Salvador. So I thought about my calendar, and I said, how about if, this was January, I said, how about if I come back in May? He said, bueno, no. So I went back, and then for 7 years, I went there 3 times a year, and we developed week-long campamentos for magic and juggling and theater and art. And then we started seeing how teaching magic empowered children with self-confidence and discipline and focus and self-esteem. And then something started happening. The first one was Wendy Rodriguez. And Wendy said, she worked in the market. She was very poor. And she worked in the market selling dry beans with her mother. And they made about $2 a day in Santa Ana, El Salvador. And there was a nursing school about 3 blocks away in a much better neighborhood. But sometimes the nursing students would walk through the marketplace because the bus terminal was just on the other side. And they would walk by Wendy. And Wendy said to me one day, she said, you know, I've always wanted to be a nurse. And there was a woman in New York who was a very good friend of mine, and she was in what's called executive search. She was finding headhunters, they call them, and she was finding executives for big banks, and she was making a lot of money. But she had no meaning in her life anymore. She just had money. So she started coming, she had gone to New York to be an actress, but she hadn't made it as an actress. She got hired by an executive search firm, the same one Edward Snowden worked for. And then she just rose up and she was making $250,000 a year. But she started coming to El Salvador to teach the magic students theater and how to be performers and how to perform their magic. And she just fell in love with the children, and especially Wendy. And she paid for Wendy a scholarship. She started a scholarship fund for Magicians Without Borders, which is still in existence. And Pedro ended up going to culinary school, and Maricela and Jaime, who said, "When are you coming back?" He became a computer repairman. And so we started seeing somehow learning magic awakened dreams that the impossible was possible. Maybe me, who just sells beans $2 a day, can become a nurse. She's now bought her mother a house, and they're living in a beautiful house, and she makes, all kinds of money, and she's a geriatric nurse, and Peter's a cook in a restaurant. And anyhow, that became the next evolution, the educating and empowering children by teaching them magic. We're not so much trying to get them to be professional magicians. It's hard enough to be a professional magician in the United States or Colombia, let alone a poor country like El Salvador that has hardly any economy. But teaching magic gives them confidence and discipline and focus and self-esteem, and then it awakens dreams, and we help make those dreams come true. I mean, there are two, and one of them is here in Colombia, who in some ways maybe we have an expression in English, the poster child for Magicians Without Borders, and she's one of Carlos Lopez's students. And she lives in the Ciudad Bolivar slum of Bogota, very, very poor, but very intelligent and a wonderful, wonderful young woman. And she just worked at the magic, and became a good performer. And again, it awakened hopes and dreams in her. And she finished high school, one of the very first people in her family to finish high school. And then she got accepted to a private university to study business. And she didn't have money to pay for it. And Carlos called me very excited from Bogota, and he said, Tamara has gotten accepted to a private university, and she's very excited, but she doesn't have money to pay for it. And I said, well, of course we have the scholarship fund. And he said, yes, I know, but I just want to see maybe what she can do on her own. And so a few weeks later, she was doing a performance at a fundación not far from where she lives. And as part of her performance, she told her story about learning magic and then getting accepted to finishing high school and then getting accepted to a university, and that she doesn't have money to pay for it, but she's going to figure that out. And after the show, the director of the fundación said, do you think you could start a program here at our fundación like you had at Bella Flor, where you were? And she said, yes, I can do that. And she said, I'll pay you to do it. And she happens to pay her about $2,000 a year, which is just enough money for her to pay for her college. So she's like the perfect story where she, learning magic, developed her confidence and her dreams and her ambitions, and then she got into college, and magic is now helping her pay for it. And so that's one of the stories that really touched my heart and my head and every part of me. Carlos brought her to New York a few months ago, and she was the guest of honor at a gathering for raising support for Magicians Without Borders, and she was absolutely wonderful. And just yesterday I saw a performance by her students, and they're just doing wonderfully. So, and there's another woman, if we have time I can tell you about her, in India. Her name is Priyanka, and she grew up in a very, very difficult situation. Her mother is a sex worker in one of the brothels of Mumbai, and Priyanka grew up sleeping under the bed with her mother working all night on the bed on top of her. So this is like an unimaginable way to grow up. And there was a woman who came to that part of Mumbai where the brothels are, and she had an ingenious idea. Her name is Priti Patkar, and Mrs. Patkar decided to create night care shelters in the red light district of Mumbai. So at 5 o'clock, the women bring their children to one of Mrs. Patkar's shelters at night, and the children get fed and played with and bathed, and they sleep there safe all night. And then the moms come back in the morning, and these women are really wonderful women and good mothers. They're just trapped for all kinds of reasons in this terrible life they are forced to live. And they pick their children up in the morning and take them to school, you know. And now Mrs. Patkar's program called Prerana, which is, anyhow, I'll tell you what this means, has started schools, and the kids now go to school, and they have a safe house for some of the older girls, because 70% of the children of sex workers end up in the sex trade themselves. So she's trying to put an end to second generation sex trafficking. So there are a group of girls living in this safe house. And I was telling her about our program in El Salvador. And she said, do you think you could start a program for 12 of our young women here in Mumbai? And so I said, sure, let's try it. So now it's been going for 7 years, and the best magician in the group is Priyanka, and she graduated from high school and now college, and she is starting to take over Magicians Without Borders. She's now 21, and she's taking over Magicians Without Borders in India. She's teaching the original group, which has now new girls in it, and a boys' orphanage, and she's working for Magicians Without Borders, performing, and she's going to be starting in 2 months to get her degree as a social worker. So she's another wonderful success, you know. That's interesting. So many people say it must be very difficult to go and see such suffering in refugee camps, in orphanages, in places like Mumbai with these girls whose moms are sex workers. But there's something, I think what keeps me going is to see how the magic and the learning of it, and what I would say the practicing, or the learning, practicing, and performing of magic. One day I was sitting with Mrs. Patkar, and Priyanka and 2 other girls were performing, and she's watching. This was about 3 years ago, and she leaned over to me and whispered in my ear during the performance. She said, when I see Priyanka performing with such poise and dignity, I know she will never end up in the sex trade, you know? And that just made all those years of teaching her and going to India 3 or 4 times a year and having week-long camps with the girls just so worth it, you know. We do see a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty, But we also see a lot of growth and change and magic. Yesterday in Ciudad Bolivar in Paradiso, Tamara's students went around and said what they love about doing magic, you know. And I think almost every one of them said, I love the feeling of making other people smile and making other people happy, especially when they're sad and they need to feel happy. My magic can help them feel a little better. That making money and being famous, that's terrific. But to also remember that magic can make people like alive in ways they haven't been since they were little children maybe, and have a sense of wonder and surprise and joy inside of them. And I wouldn't want magicians to ever forget that, you know, that's hopefully feeds them, you know, as well as their bank account, you know. And I hope that gets big also, but it's maybe not the most important thing. And I just wanted to say, about 6 months ago or so, I had just done some magic spontaneously. I just had a few things with me, a couple of sponge balls, some coins, a couple pieces of rope. And it was just amazing what joy these simple, silly little things, these sponge balls and a coin and a piece of rope. I just feel so grateful that magic has come into my life, and that with these crazy little things you can bring such happiness and joy to the world. I have to answer it in a slightly different way than maybe most magicians answer it. There is a woman named Dorothy Day who started houses for homeless people and fed people who lived on the street food in what she called houses of hospitality. And I lived with her in one of those houses for a number of years, a couple of years. And I learned a lot about serving the poor. So that was one influence. The most important psychological influence as a psychologist is a psychologist named Carl Jung. And Jung was very much about dreams and the imagination and the spirit. And he really fed me as a psychologist the way Dorothy Day fed me as a compassionate human being. And then the most important magician in my life was Verner.
Yeah, we love it.
And when we had our magic shop, was making his last tour.
You're back.
It was actually, he made 2 more final tours because he lived to be, 101 years old, and pretty healthy, even though he smoked big cigars and drank whiskey. He stayed healthy till he was over 100 years old. He came to our magic shop and gave a lecture. And then he gave me a copy of Verner's Book of Magic. And my last name is Verner, Verner. And he wrote in my book, it's one of my most precious objects. He wrote, to Tom Verner, from Die Vernon, also known as David Verner. And he signed it. So he really, my favorite trick is the cups and balls, which I learned from him. So I think to be natural when you're doing your magic, to make it look natural and not stiff and formal. And he really wanted your magic to look like it was magic, you know. And you don't do that by making fancy moves. You do it by making it look very ordinary, you know. And I think he also how dedicated he was to magic and how much he practiced, and he would do second deals for 4 hours a day, just until his fingers hurt, And I think that kind of devotion to magic and practicing, and I think that's what I learned from him. Let me think. I think Di Vernon's Book of Magic, I think, with linking rings, with the cups and balls, with triumph, all those amazing things are in that book. Harry Lorraine's book, Close-Up Card Magic, I think for me was the most important. It's both something that serious beginners can learn from, and yet also really advanced magicians. Stars of Magic, the collection of manuscripts, I think has been also very important. Yeah, there's a book by a philosopher named Jacob Needleman called The Sorcerers, and it's about a magic club in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s, and it very much is about how magic can really help a young person develop into a real full human being, and remain a child but not be childish, but have a child still alive inside of them, no matter what they do with their life. We have a website that I'm learning how to use from Carlos Lopez in Bogota. He's trying to drag me into the 21st century. I'm kicking and screaming, but he's doing wonders for this old man. So it's simply magicianswithoutborders.com, and if you want to make a donation, you can make a donation on that website. And we don't have big corporate donors. We have many small donors. So anything people want to contribute would be very helpful. And on that are lots of stories about our travels. And the most recent ones are from 5 weeks ago. My wife and I spent 2 weeks on the U.S.-Mexico border performing for those children jailed in those detention centers by the idiot Donald Trump. And we brought a little bit of joy to those children. And we were the very first entertainers to ever be allowed in there. And it took us 4 months of just calling and calling and calling, and finally I got my senator, Patrick Leahy, who's the senior senator in the United States Senate, to call them and say, let these people in, and they finally let us in, And just to end with my favorite story, we were on the Iran-Afghan border in a refugee camp, and we walked into the refugee camp, and there was a wonderful Afghan with a turban and a big white beard, bigger and whiter than mine even. And we sat down to have our first cup of tea together. And he finally said, where would you like to perform? And I said, if we could perform in an inside space, that would be wonderful. But he got this kind of puzzled look on his face, and he said, well, the only inside space is the mosque.
Well, I have not dated anyone in Yale.
We would be honored to have you perform magic in the mosque. So they brought in 500 girls, and we did a show for them, and then they brought in 500 boys, and we did a show for them. And afterwards, we were sitting having another cup of tea, and he said, the international agencies take very good care of us. They give us a place to live, security, food, clothing. He said, and I don't mean any blame by this. He said, but I think sometimes they think we're only bodies. I've been in this camp for 17 years, and you're the first entertainer to ever come here. And today you fed the minds and imaginations of those children, and they'll be talking and thinking about this magic show for many, many months. God bless you. Please come back again. So that was the mission of Magicians Without Borders. Said better than I've ever said it. So.